As you may be aware, an Australian delegation went to Vietnam at the end of July to conduct the annual human rights dialogue with the Vietnamese government. In order to find out more about this event, I'm very grateful to have Elaine Pearson, Director, Australian Human Rights Watch, with us today. Well, welcome to SBTN Australia.
Thanks for having me.
Elaine, before we go into the details of the Human Rights Dialogue, I'd like to ask you a question about Human Rights Watch in Australia. What is your, in terms of structure, organisation and finance, what are the similarities and the differences with similar organisations like Amnesty International and Freedom House?
Okay. Well, Human Rights Watch is an international human rights organisation. We investigate human rights abuses wherever they happen around the world. We document those in reports, and then we advocate and lobby governments in order to press for change. And I think we have a lot of similarities with Amnesty and some of the other bigger human rights groups. But what's different about us is that we're not a membership-based organisation. So we have a much smaller staff. We have only 400 staff around the world, covering 90 different countries. And what we really try and do with that information is expose it to the media and then use that information to press for change. In terms of our work here in Australia, we're quite new. We just set up the office 1 year ago, and our focus is really on foreign policy issues. So what we want to do is we want to encourage the Australian government to prioritise human rights when it's having strategic discussions on trade, economic issues, security issues with other countries. We only have 3 staff, so we're pretty small, but Vietnam is certainly one of the important countries on our radar.
Just before the end of the month, when the Human Rights Dialogue was about to take place, you released a statement calling on the Australian delegation to demand that the Vietnamese government take concrete steps to improve the abysmal human rights situation in Vietnam. I think that was the term that you used.
Yes.
So on what basis do you describe the human rights situation in Vietnam, and why is it so?
Well, I think Vietnam is one of the most repressive countries, certainly in Asia. There are no elections there. Everything is very tightly controlled by the Communist Party. Vietnam is also one of the countries that still has a lot of political prisoners, and these are people who are thrown in prison simply for participating in protests, writing something online, criticising the government, sometimes handing out leaflets. And so we think that, you know, these people, they shouldn't be thrown in prison. Actually, they should be leaders in their community if they're raising concerns in a legitimate, peaceful way. And so we think with the Human Rights Dialogue, this happens once a year between Australia and Vietnam, and it's a really important opportunity for the Australian government to prioritise some of these key issues and really press the government to make concrete improvements. It shouldn't just be about having sort of a once-a-year chat behind closed doors where we don't know what is discussed. You know, this is really an opportunity to set some benchmarks and say in a year's time, this is where we expect to have improvements.
As you mentioned, this is, I think, the 11th annual Human Rights Dialogue. It started, I think, back in 2002. But for the last 11 years, have we seen any improvements in human rights in Vietnam? And as you say, everything happens behind closed doors. Are these human rights dialogue just talk and nothing else much?
Well, we don't have a lot of faith, I would say, in the human rights dialogue alone bringing about a lot of effectiveness in improving the human rights situation in Vietnam. I think the dialogue is simply one tool of many, and it shouldn't be an excuse for governments not to raise these issues when they have meetings, you know, at the presidential, prime ministerial level. They should also be raising human rights in meetings between the foreign ministries. So it shouldn't be an excuse just to park human rights issues to one side. But at the same time, I mean, it's very difficult for us to know whether it's the human rights dialogue that has led to specific improvements. I would say where there has been improvements, clearly on the economic front, you know, people think of Vietnam as really one of the, you know, stronger economies that has really improved over the last decade in Asia. And that has brought about, you know, important improvements in terms of economic and social rights. But when it comes to civil and political rights in Vietnam, we've actually seen a lot of backsliding in that area. We've seen increasing repression in terms of censorship with bloggers, particularly as sort of online media presence has grown, and I guess the government has found that it can't control everything through the state media. And we're particularly concerned about attacks on religious minorities and the fact that there's a lot of restrictions over churches and religious groups. And if they're not sanctioned by the state, then a lot of these religious groups also face a lot of repression, lengthy prison terms, and so on.
In your statement, I think you also mentioned the fact that Vietnam recently released a number of political prisoners, but then immediately rearrested or arrested a larger number of bloggers and dissidents and so on. Is it fair to say that the Vietnamese government is trying to use these prisoners as a tool, as a pawn in the negotiation, bilateral relationship with, say, Australia, America, and the Western world, simply using every time there is something to be negotiated, that they just simply release one or two political prisoners?
Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that political prisoners are being used as bargaining chips in terms of these international negotiations. And it seems to me that it's a revolving door of prisoners who are coming in and out of prison. And so, for instance, when the negotiations are on the table for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we did see a number of prisoners released. But at the same time, we saw even more prisoners, new prisoners being arrested. So I think this is really problematic. And I think, you know, what really needs to happen is that those laws that are on the books need to be changed that allow these people to go to prison for peaceful acts of free expression. So you have a lot of provisions actually under the Penal Code of Vietnam that have things like abusing democratic rights and freedoms or spreading anti-state propaganda. And these carry pretty severe prison terms. And so it's really important actually that these provisions are removed from the books so there's no more excuses or justifications for the government to arrest people.
The Vietnamese government is arguing that its penal code is providing for situations whereby people abuse their human rights. Can there be such a concept? Can you abuse your rights? If it's a right, then obviously people should be able to enjoy it. How do you answer to that claim by the Vietnamese regime?
Well, I think, yes, you can have laws that actually restrict basic human rights. And I mean, there are international treaties on these issues, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There is an international right to freedom of expression. And governments should only restrict that where it's really necessary in terms of national security. And I think this is where we get into, you know, some issues around, you know, what is strictly necessary is very different for the Vietnamese government than is what is strictly necessary here in Australia. And so I think, you know, Vietnam really needs to have those discussions. And this is an opportunity for Australia, for the US, to really look at those restrictions and say these restrictions are far too broad. It encompasses a whole range of different acts from, you know, you could say terrorist acts could be included, crimes that are committed, you know, with violent intent, but also just peaceful acts like, you know, expressing views that are different to the views of the government or handing out leaflets. And we certainly don't think that those acts need to be punished in the criminal code.
And particularly under Article 258, the regime has been targeting a lot of bloggers. Yes. And how do you make a representation to the Australian government and the US government that such a practice, such a law cannot be in any way justifiable or acceptable?
Well, I think there are other ways of addressing issues where it is a case of deliberately spreading misinformation. We have other laws on the books, like defamation, like libel, which do provide opportunities for whether it's a government or an individual or a company to sue where misinformation is being provided. But we don't think that there needs to be criminal penalties, and it's very different to have a provision in the criminal code that allows a government to then, you know, imprison someone for a long time simply on the basis of their opinion. And I think it's really important that, you know, Australian officials do find opportunities like the Human Rights Dialogue to raise these issues. And I think there was last Wednesday, as part of the Human Rights Dialogue, actually a seminar on non-state media and on freedom of expression. I think that is probably an important first step in that direction.
And of course, a number of bloggers and dissidents were prevented from attending that seminar, I think organised by the Australian Embassy in Hanoi in conjunction with the other embassies.
Exactly. So it was arranged by a number of foreign embassies, but unfortunately a number of the people who were invited were not even able to attend. So we know that, for instance, one of the bloggers was prevented from getting on her flight to Hanoi. She was detained by the government, I think, for 7 or 8 hours. And then after that, obviously, it was too late. So, she was released, but she couldn't participate. So these are fundamental things that, the Vietnamese government needs to address. If people can't even attend, a basic seminar to talk about these issues, then what's the point of having a human rights dialogue with a foreign government?
And look, that pretty much took place was the Australian delegation was coming to Vietnam to participate in the annual human rights dialogue. So what kind of message does the Vietnamese regime send to the Australian delegation? That is, really, this is just for show, well, let's come and have a chat, but, we're going to continue doing what we're doing, which is, abuse or locking up the people that wants to abuse the human rights, so to speak.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew what was discussed behind closed doors, but unfortunately, Human Rights Watch was not able to attend. I would expect that probably the Vietnam government would be quite would be trying to sort of justify that they need to do these things, that if they don't, they won't be able to keep sort of a lid on, issues of public order and harmony in the state. This is usually the response that we get when we release our statements by the Vietnamese government or the Vietnamese state media, that we don't understand that, actually the Vietnamese government needs to do this in order to maintain harmony amongst citizens.
There always seems to be that excuse of misunderstanding. You mentioned about the dialogue and how it takes place behind closed doors. If I remember correctly, there was an inquiry into the annual human rights dialogue between Australia and Vietnam, Australia and China.
Yes.
And I think there were some recommendations that DFAT officials perhaps will be briefing interested stakeholders about what took place in this annual human rights dialogue. Where do you see that going, whether that recommendation will be adopted in the future?
Well, I know when it comes to the China Human Rights Dialogue, about a month after the dialogue, they did actually hold a briefing for NGOs in Canberra. So I would presume with the Vietnam one that they would also have some kind of opportunity to discuss what was briefed. However, we were quite disappointed with the formal statement that came out from the Australian government after the dialogue. It was very vague. It didn't talk in any specifics about exactly what was discussed. It failed to list benchmarks or specific improvements that Vietnam had agreed to. So, frankly, I think that, we need to move beyond these sort of very broad statements and actually come down to quite clear, specific things that need to be achieved on a year-by-year basis. I
think Helen Clark, writing for The Diplomats, presented an argument that in terms of human rights dialogue with Vietnam, Australia is taking a constructive approach, not coming out in the open criticizing the regime, unlike the United States. But she, I think, argued that this is where Australia tend to yield more result by adopting that approach. Do you believe that a softly approach works when it comes to human rights situation in Vietnam?
Well, I don't think it needs to be an either-or situation. I think you can have very sort of strong principled engagement with the government on the one hand, but that doesn't mean that it should stop you from actually speaking out publicly when serious human rights violations are committed. And I think in that sense, I would like to see Australia probably adopting a bit of a stronger stance on these issues, because our experience is that governments actually behave better when they know that they're being watched, when they know they're being monitored. They are very sensitive about their reputation, and so the best way to get this message across is publicly. And I think also, the government needs to think about how the Vietnamese state media is going to be spinning this visit as a success, everything's okay, and so it should be trying to find opportunities where it can speak publicly to the people of Vietnam, so that those messages aren't simply able to be co-opted by the government.
As a country, Australia is giving to Vietnam in terms of development aid, I think in the vicinity of $150 million a year. And a lot of members of the Vietnamese community feel that those monies should be tied to improvements in conditions in human rights. What is Human Rights Watch position on tying aid with human rights improvements?
I mean, I think if that money is being given for human rights purposes, then absolutely you need to include benchmarks in there. It would be silly, it would be a waste of money simply to just give that money with the hope that it's being dispersed correctly. But it really, I guess, depends on what is the purpose of the aid money. And I think there definitely needs to be sort of stringent controls and sort of looking at where the money is going. And, you know, is the money sort of reaching the people who, you know, it is intended to reach? And is it having the desired effect? And I think, you know, part of the problem with many countries is that if the money is simply going to the government, sometimes it can be very difficult to know if, you know, it goes to one ministry, is that actually filtering down and reaching the communities that it's desired to help?
Obviously, we have another event that took place in Vietnam was the delegation, Australian delegation was there conducting the annual Human Rights Dialogue, and that is the visit of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion. He concluded his visit and issued a preliminary statement. And I think in summary he said that the situation of freedom of religion in Vietnam is far from ideal. There's still oppression of freedom of religion, particularly in the rural areas. Yeah. So how do you assess that in relation to the annual Human Rights Dialogue? I mean, you've got 12 or 11 or 12 successive annual Human Rights Dialogue, and here we have Special Rapporteur giving pretty much a damning report on the freedom of religion situation in Vietnam.
Well, absolutely. I think freedom of religion is one of the most serious human rights issues in Vietnam. And I think it was, you know, wonderful that the Special Rapporteur was there and was able to sort of look into these issues. But unfortunately, as he said in his statement, he actually had to interrupt his visit, which is highly unusual for a UN expert. And this was because the people that he was speaking to faced intimidation, harassment, and various, you know, forms of coercion. In some cases, they were prevented from meeting with him because, you know, due to the Vietnamese security forces. And so I think this is really damning that even when a UN international expert on religious freedom goes to a country, they're not actually able to safely meet the people who, you know, are basically going to provide him the information to write the report. Now, I do understand that his preliminary statement that he has released has raised concern, particularly about organised religion and the fact that a lot of these sort of smaller churches that fall outside of that have faced a lot of harassment from the authorities. And I think, you know, this is certainly an issue that he will be continuing to pay close attention to.
Apart from the situation in relation to freedom of expression with the arrest of the bloggers, freedom of religion, all the concerns that have been pointed out by the Special Rapporteur, what other areas of human rights abuses are you concerned about in Vietnam?
Well, one specific area is forced labour in drug rehabilitation centres in Vietnam. And we documented this practice a couple of years ago. We issued a report. And this is basically drug users in Vietnam are picked up, are often sent to these drug detention centres where there's no due process. They can be held there for up to 4 years. And part of their drug treatment is actually that they're forced to work. So we know that forced labour is going on in these centres. Sometimes it's agricultural work, garment manufacturing. In some cases it's shelling of cashew nuts. And we've actually managed in our research to trace the sale of some of those cashew nuts through supply chains to Australia. So we think that the Australian government should be very concerned about what's going on in these drug detention centres. They should be publicly calling for such centres to be closed. They don't provide any real rehabilitative treatment. And there's lots of other community-based models that would be far more effective, actually, in dealing with drug abuse issues, rather than, you know, forcing someone to work and keeping them in a closed setting where other abuses occur, beatings, you know, torture, confinement, and so on.
I think there's another area where the Australian government has been making representation to Vietnam, and this is the death penalty.
Yes.
There were some news reports that Vietnam was considering the abolition of the death penalty in Vietnam. What is Human Rights Watch position on that issue?
Well, we also call for for Vietnam to abolish the death penalty. This is something that we work on in many different countries around the world, including the United States, which still sentences many people every year to death. But clearly with Vietnam, I think this is an issue, particularly for people. A lot of people are there also on drugs offences, for drug smuggling and so on. And we, certainly think that this type of punishment is best avoided, and there are other ways of punishing serious crimes.
As Director of Human Rights Watch Australia, obviously your focus is in the Asia-Pacific region, in this region. What particular countries do you have concern about human rights apart from Vietnam?
Well, unfortunately in this part of the world, nearly every country, I would say, has significant human rights problems. Including Australia? Including Australia.
Yes.
Obviously with, our record of treatment on refugees and asylum seekers, our failure to adhere to international law in that area. I also do a lot of work on China. China has some similar issues to Vietnam, a lot of concerns around freedom of expression, abuses by security forces. I also do work on Burma, which has a lot of issues around recently sectarian violence, also abuses by the military, and also countries like Indonesia, which is a democracy, but at the same time, in places like Papua, continues to throw people in prison who protest against the government or who are calling for independence. So I think that, there's a lot of issues to work on in this region. And, I think we're seeing that, not a tremendous amount of progress on the human rights front. Progress in some areas, but backsliding in others.
In terms of the human rights situation in Vietnam, obviously the Vietnamese community in Australia has particular interest. So where can we and Human Rights Watch Australia can work together to improve the human rights situation in Vietnam?
Well, I think I would ask the Vietnamese community certainly to go on our website, www.hrw.org, take a look at the materials that we have on Vietnam. I think the first step to changing a situation is reading about it, educating yourself, and then thinking about who you can tell about this in order for it to make a difference. So certainly spreading that word, whether it's through social media networks, contacting your local MP, asking what they are doing to raise concerns about human rights issues in Vietnam. I think it's really important that people in Australia pay attention to this, because this is one of our neighbours, one of our important strategic trading partners in the region. And yet for a lot of Australians, they simply think of Vietnam as a nice place to go on holiday, and they don't know about the reality of what a lot of people are facing in Vietnam. So, really the first step is education and, spreading awareness.
And as you say, you've got a few staff working. If there are young Vietnamese Australians who may be interested in working for Human Rights Watch Australia, like you have voluntary positions and all that sort of things for them to participate? Yes,
we do have an intern and volunteer program. So if people are interested, again, they can apply through our website. We're very happy to host people, and we're always looking for people who can help us out from time to time, whether it's with events or background research, that kind of thing.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much, Elaine, for coming on the program to talk about the human rights situation in Vietnam. And I sincerely do hope that the Vietnamese community in Australia will have an opportunity to be working closely with Human Rights Watch Australia to promote and further the issue of human rights in Vietnam in particular, but also, as you say, in our region, Asia Pacific, where there are still a lot of countries that human rights is a concern. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Kính thưa quý khán thính giả, quý vị vừa theo dõi cuộc phỏng vấn của chúng tôi với bà Elaine Pearson, giám đốc của tổ chức Human Rights Watch Australia. Xin cảm ơn quý vị đã theo dõi và xin mong hẹn gặp lại quý vị trong chương trình trong tương lai.